As we near the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, that's next year. And my new favorite word, we will celebrate the semi-quincentennial. And more to the point, a burst of talk is anticipated about the real meaning of America's founding document. And as we move into this, as people of faith in Jesus Christ, we have a great aid this morning in Dr. Mark Valeri, who we welcome back to National Presbyterian Church. Mark was with us here in 2012, I believe, back when we had a Wednesday evening program. And Mark was just down the road in Richmond at the Presbyterian Seminary there. Since then, he has moved, and more about that in a minute. But Mark is going to help us probe some of the different perspectives that are already coming into focus, from the celebration of high ideals to the critique of social inequalities in early America. He'll also take a look at some biblical texts to help us understand how we ought to understand and even celebrate America's founding. Mark is the Reverend Priscilla Wood Neves Distinguished Professor of Religion and Politics at Washington University, which is in St. Louis. And he is currently leading the John C. Danforth Center on Religion and Politics there. And so they have some very interesting programs going on for such a time as this in the life of our country. Mark has areas of specialization in religion, social thought, economics in America, Reformation theology, the political history of Calvinism, Puritanism, and Enlightenment moral philosophy. Mark's most recent book describes how Protestant views of other religions changed from 1650 to 1765. His book, Heavenly Merchandise, How Religion Shaped Commerce in Puritan America, which was published by Princeton University Press in 2010, was awarded the Philip Schaff Prize from the American Society of Church History in 2011. And he is currently working on the topic of religious persuasion, evangelicalism, and secularism in the 18th century. Mark is an ordained PCUSA minister, and prior to his current position, as I said, he was at Union Presbyterian Theological Seminary in Richmond, and before that at Lewis and Clark College. Is it still a college? It hasn't become a university? Near Portland, Oregon. Mark earned his BA from Whitworth College, now university, his MDiv from Yale Divinity School, and his PhD in American religious history from Princeton University. A good friend and a friend of National Presbyterian Church, would you join me in welcoming Dr. Mark Valeri?
Thank you for having me. Thank you for being here. This is not a typical Sunday school class. I would think a typical Sunday school class, we would burrow down into some scripture, we would talk some theology, and I'm here to talk to you this morning as a historian and how historians work on 1776. So what we'll do this morning, we'll do a little bit of work with scripture, but I think that we just put this into our box as we deal with a Christian community, especially living in this city, with how we think about our origins, how we use this 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence to think about our relationship as a community of faith to our nation and everything that it's undergoing these days. There are a couple handouts on the seats. One of them is an outline called How to Observe 1776. I won't cover everything that's in it, because I do want to leave time for questions and comments. And the second sheet has some quotations, especially the first couple Bible ones and the ones in the bottom. So may the Lord bless us. So how to observe 1776. I've got to tell you that I have more 1776 events in my life and coming down the pike that you can imagine. So many venues, so many events. I think nearly every state, I'm being literal here, has a quincentennial commission on how to observe. And these state commissions are putting together ways to think about and commemorate. Some people say celebrate, some people talk about commemoration. I spoke 2 years ago, the first one of these was with the University of Pennsylvania Law School, and it was Law and the Revolution, and I was there speaking at that conference so with a bunch of lawyers who were very lawyerly, and talked about things like interesting bail law in the late 18th century and how the American Revolution changed it. So very lawyerly stuff. I was talking about religious freedom. I'm putting together a program in conjunction with our center and Brown University. It will be in Providence, Rhode Island, home of Roger Williams, a sort of prophet of religious liberty, and that conference will be on religious liberty in the 250th. I just learned a couple days ago that American University, stone's throw away, is doing a special series of lectures and events on the 250th. My university, Washington University in St. Louis, is putting on a special course with outside speakers and inside speakers on it. Believe it or not, there's a place called Shaker Village in Lexington, Kentucky, that is putting on a big 250th event that will be at. So it's all over the place. And we, as a Christian community, should be aware of it and thinking about it and thinking about the response. What if someone came to you and say, well, how do you, as a Christian, think about this? Is one sort of way to imagine. So how do historians think about it? I want to frame our discussion beginning with two extremes on how to think about the 250th. The first extreme was represented by the 1776 commission or project, it's called by two names, put together under the first Trump administration, the goal of which was to produce documents and learning tools, materials for schools that celebrated the great ideals of the American founding and the exceptional nature of the religious experiment. Very celebratory. The names would have been very familiar names: Thomas Jefferson and George Washington and Benjamin Franklin and James Madison, and the great ideals that make America and empower us to this very day. So that's one sort of extreme. Celebration, American exceptionalism. This is the great experiment of liberty of a divinely called, empowered nation. That make you resonate with that. On the other side is something called the 1619 Project. It began with an editorial published in the New York Times by Nicole Hannah-Jones, an early American historian. And that book came out as a specific rejoinder to celebrations of America that tends to overlook the deep, dark past. And it's called the 1619 Project because it says American history does not begin in 1776. It begins in 1619 when the first English colonists purchased enslaved African peoples. It was in Virginia. And that project says, we've learned enough about the ideals that are stated in the Declaration of Independence. Let's look at the social reality behind it. The social reality is that the enslavement of African peoples and the taking of indigenous land, often by force and violence, is the story to tell. If America is exceptionalist, it's exceptional in its deep, dark, troubled social past. So what is it we should be focused on as we think about this? Let me go into a little bit more depth on that celebratory approach, as I'll call it, the 1776 project or commission approach. It assumes in much of its literature that America is a divinely called nation, that we were founded by Christians and imbued with Christian ideals that linked up with democratic ideals of self-representation, of liberty, of freedom, especially of religion, freedom especially to be Protestant. And I ran across a picture just a couple days ago of, you might be able to picture it in your mind, of George Washington praying at Valley Forge. Does anybody here recall? It's a painting of George Washington, yes. It was done actually in the 1960s or 70s, I think. But it's a beautiful painting, and there's George Washington's horse, and he is beside his horse in the snows at Valley Forge, bended on one knee, fervently praying. That image sticks in my mind of representing this first celebratory approach. That approach then says that we were founded with Christian convictions and Christian identities, and that's part of our nationhood, and that we have fallen from that. We have declined from that, and we especially fell from that, I don't know, in the 1960s, say, and the rise of secularism, the loss of belief in our public life and institutions, especially universities and intellectual life, changing sexual mores, changing attitudes towards drugs, changing attitude towards social expressions across the board, and increasing secularization has brought America down, and this 250th is a chance to recover, to renew, to gain back what we once had, which is our identity as a morally upright Christian nation. The favorite scriptural texts, often cited, you have on your sheet there from 2 Chronicles 7:14. I take these two texts because they're very often cited by those who think this is a time to celebrate the nation. 2 Chronicles 7:14, if my people, which are called by my name, shall humble themselves and pray and seek my face, and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven and will forgive their sin and heal their land. You catch the resonance here of this is what this should be about. We are going to hear the Lord's voice again, and that we're going to repent from our wickedness and our secularism and our boundless sexual activities, however you want to put it. Then the Lord will restore health to our land. Second favorite scripture text from this group, from Psalm 32, verse 12. Blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord. Now those are Old Testament Hebrew Bible texts, and what most Bible scholars don't like this kind of use of these texts. They think it's a misreading of the text. They'll point out that if my people, who are called by my name, actually does not refer to contemporary America, but refers to the Hebrew people of the Davidic kingship, the kingship under David. And to apply it to us is rather preposterous, presumptuous to say the least. And blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord is critiqued by biblical scholars because there's no notion of a modern nation state in the Hebrew Bible. Nations mean people groups. Nations don't refer to governments with capital cities and fixed boundaries. A nation means a people group. So blessed is the people who worship Yahweh is the better translation of that text. Bible scholars also say it's interesting that these people who want to be just celebratory often pull from the Hebrew Bible text, because the New Testament is actually not very positive about the nation. Nations are provisional. They go away. All you have to do is read the book of Revelation, especially chapters 5 and 13 of the book of Revelation, to see that secular governments, powerful nation states, are always a threat to the godly community. They're never a promise. The only covenanted people is the people who worship God in name and truth, and it has very little to do with militaries and governments and structures that are applied to nationalism. So there's a celebratory approach. It is there. There's a remnant. The 1776 Commission kind of faded away, but there's still movements to inject this mindset into public schools and into public ceremonies. But there's a second celebratory story that I find more compatible with my sense of things, that says that this was an extraordinary event, 1776. The affirmations of freedoms and liberties went way beyond the English model with an inherited aristocracy and a very limited sense of voting rights. I mean, one could vote in England to send people to Parliament, but very limited. That membership in Parliament, much of it was hereditary, and that we just got beyond that. The notion of consent, that the authority for government consists in consent of the people governed, was a new thing. The claim especially to universal and unalienable rights from the Declaration is a very new move of this period. Unalienable rights is a really interesting phrase. Think about it. The notion that people had rights was there before in modern Europe, but those rights you could always alienate yourself from by consenting to power. Unalienable rights means you have them no matter what, and you can't get rid of them. And no one else can get rid of them from you. That case is true, except for, as my lawyer friends would point out, except if you commit severe crimes. Then those rights are no longer unalienable. But outside of that, these are new things. And we ought to be aware that there was something new that happened in 1776. Something to celebrate, something to think about with gratitude. But I do want to turn a few minutes to the critical perspective, the 1619 perspective. Nicole Hannah-Jones wrote in her essay for the New York Times, which introduced this book, the phrase that anti-black racism is endemic to America's DNA. The fact that so much of the nation depended on enslaved peoples is a fact with which we must reckon, and that inheritance lives with us to this day. I just heard a very wonderful theological speaker, J. Cameron Carter, now at the University of California of Irvine, give a talk on David Walker, who wrote in the 1820s, 1830s as a freed slave. David Walker wrote this: "We colored people," this is quotes on the sheet, "of these United States are the most degraded, wretched, and abject set of beings that ever lived since the world began. And I pray God that none like us ever may live until time shall be no more." They tell us of the Israelites in Egypt under slavery, the Helots in Sparta, the Spartan slaves, and of the Roman slaves. Those heathen nations of antiquity had but little more among them than the name and form of slavery, while wretchedness and endless miseries were reserved to be poured out upon our fathers, ourselves, and our children by Christian Americans. That's a perspective that we need to wrestle with and think about. David Walker's perspective, which is so important for understanding where we are as a nation. Carter went on, J. Cameron Carter, in his talk to say that authoritarianism, of course, rising in the news a lot these days, and exclusion, resistance to immigrants, these things are not, as according to Carter, not merely a foreign intrusion into American independence, but rather embedded in American independence. The enslavement of Africans, the dispossession of the lands of indigenous peoples, the exploiting of lower-class Europeans who came here as servants. We the people, says Carter, of the first line of the Constitution, contain within its own expression these exclusionary, authoritarian, racially tinged problems. A friend of mine named Linford Fisher, who's a historian at Brown, begins an essay on our commemoration of 1776 with the following single claim. With American independence, the American government claimed at one fell swoop 250 million acres of indigenous lands as their own. David French, great New York Times columnist, David French writes it, I read it, says that America's story must go through not only the founding period, not only the Civil War period, the Reconstruction period, 1865 to 1877, the period when African Americans were given votes and elected their first representative to federal Congress and first representative to the federal Senate. Reconstruction period came crashing down when the federal government removed troops from southern cities, and first of all on a local level and then on a state level began a very strong exclusion of African Americans from participation, barriers to voting, holding office illegal in certain places. How do we put together that part of our history? As Christians, as biblical Christians, we ought to understand that being self-critical is not a bad move. It's a biblical move. Try reading Jeremiah, right? Jeremiah said he was a patriot. He loved Israel. But his book is a book of critique. My point, to get to it, is rather than read 1776 merely as a celebration of American exceptionalism, or merely as a tale of social degradation and woes. What we need to do is use this occasion to go back to the history and the documents to allow our imagination to expand as Christians, to set our situation against those ideals and use those ideals to instruct us, to not do away with the study of those ideals, but to think of what a remarkable beginning this was. I said this in yesterday's talk. St. Augustine had this image of how a Christian ought to view politics as this largely dark story of violence and oppression and looking for areas where divine love breaks through. Where divine love breaks through. And I think I want us to do this with 1776, to learn the history, to read the text, to pushes us to think beyond ourselves, to think again about what happened in 1776, to read some Jefferson, to read the Declaration, to read The Federalist Papers, for goodness sakes. The papers that were written as a kind of public debate in preparation for the vote on the federal Constitution. I think those are worthy, wonderful tasks that can help us to talk and think about these things in ways that get us beyond this almost inescapable fixation on contemporary, day-by-day political news. We get caught in these binds of the political, partisan fracturing. And we can't think beyond it. And I don't know about you, but there are times when I just say, no more. I know how bad it is. No more, please. And be lifted up into thinking about a higher perspective, it seems to me, is very good. Ken Burns, the documentary filmmaker, is just finishing up a documentary on the American Revolution. And he wrote about it, and he said, what I discovered in making this documentary is the revolution began when a group of rich white landowners decided to assume power for themselves and get rid of British control. But that's not where it ended. It ended with farmers and tradesmen and dock workers and rural and urban people of lower classes getting together and saying self-rule and in universal rights is something we are going to join in with. And that Burns said, that's my story of the American Revolution. Yes, it does begin with white plantation slave owners, but through it, it begins to take up more people. I think this perspective is especially crucial for students. I'm a college professor. My students, many of whom don't grasp the importance of high ideals, who would look from a quote from Jefferson or the Declaration and say, that has very little to do with me. I have my own little interest groups, and they typically are motivated by financial employment concerns. And I understand those. They're my students, but I want to lift them up. And I think we ought to lift each other up by talking about these as ways to gain a different perspective, to set up an external standard to our contemporary political noise, where high ideals can reveal by contrast our current situation. After all, some embarrassment about doing 1776 and thinking about it. There's some embarrassment about it, especially on the political left, because they want to go back to the 1619 project-ish view. That embarrassment can lead to an introversion, a cynicism, a lack of hope. Eric Foner, who is another historian, very left-winging, very politically liberal. But he says, I don't like the 1619 project for the following reason. Because racism, we must not say, is embedded in our DNA. Because if that's the case, we can never change it. And I want to say, racism and the slave system and the taking of indigenous lands was a period in our history that we can and ought to continually attempt to overcome inch by inch, piece by piece. And it's those ideals that can guide us on the way. I like that perspective a lot. I'm a historian of religion in American history, and there's recent turns in the study of religion and the American Revolution that expands our thinking. It's not a Christian nationalist perspective that comes out of the recent histories of religion in the American Revolution. It is rather the sense that when evangelically oriented or highly devout Christians talked about the theological reasons they were engaging in this rebellion against Britain, when they talked about that, they didn't talk about the American exceptionalism. It wasn't even a nation yet. But they tended to say Christian faith stands against a highly elite class in which money is concentrated. They did not like aristocracy. They did not like the British aristocracy, and they did not like aristocracy anywhere. That's where religion partly contributed, or the notion of self-critique. Do you know that slavery was outlawed in Massachusetts in the state constitution passed in 1777? Slavery was outlawed soon, around that same period, by Connecticut and by several of the northern states. It's that sense of self-critique. I've read more sermons in the Revolutionary period than I'd care to recount, and almost every one of these sermons say this: God is with us in our fight against Britain because Britain is oppressive and has denied us especially our right to worship God as we think best. And so God is with us. However, if we continue to hold slaves and to engage in the slave trade, we will be wispily gone in the story of history. We will not succeed because of the internal fractures and the social problems that are created by the system. High ideals shaped these people. The vote, by the way, the vote for independence was not very pragmatic. Think about it, what these Americans were doing. I tell my students that when a British warship showed up, they showed off too, but when they showed up, especially blockading the port of Boston, it would be akin to an aircraft carrier, fully armed, loaded, showing up right outside your city. The British warship was a thing of massive, massive destruction. And it amazes me to think that these people said, in a very unpragmatic session, said, we are going to break from that. The audacity of it is remarkable. And I think it can teach us, recovering the story, to be audacious in our sense and our pursuit of justice and social reform. Even though it's not pragmatically, it gets us out of the pragmatic political thinking, to do things, to imagine a story that is much more than we now have. The revolution was a long shot. It was a long bet till about 1780 when we finally made treaties with France and Spain. Those treaties not only secured French naval ships and French forces. If you've ever been to Yorktown, have you ever been to Yorktown? The thing that blew me away is you walk through the encampment area and there's all these, where the French soldiers were camped in their various units. When we made the treaty with France, and then we made a treaty with Spain in which Spain largely gave us massive amounts of loans of money. Until that point, the American Revolution was a long shot. After that point, it was an even bet. So, closing off with some new histories. What are the new histories moving toward that are coming down the pike, that are what my colleagues are writing? First of all, there's a new approach that places the American movement in the context of a worldwide, or at least Western-wide movement. The Americans weren't the only ones seeking independence from colonial powers and trumpeting the ideas of unalienable rights, natural rights, religious liberty. This is happening as well in the Netherlands. France itself is moving in this direction. This is not solely an American story. Many of the Caribbean islands begin to talk in such terms. Many of the Spanish colonies, and now the southwestern United States, that it's not merely a United States story. It is a larger global story in which we are involved. I think the second thing that historians are doing is they're being very more attentive to the inclusion of indigenous American stories. Names like contemporary historians Colin Calloway, Kathleen Duvall, talk about what we need to bring the story of indigenous peoples in more, not just because it's politically fashionable to do so, but because the participants in the revolution themselves talked an awful lot about indigenous people. In treaties, and on whose side the indigenous people were allied, on what to do with different indigenous people, in beginning to recognize there was no single massive indigenous population, but they were divided up into nations and people groups that have different ideas, and I think we need a much fuller account of that. We also need the notion this is a Christian nation. I think that the majority of people at the Revolutionary period would have confessed Christianity, and especially a Protestant form of it. But there were Jews in colonial America. There's a synagogue in Rhode Island. George Washington writes that synagogue soon after the Revolution, the synagogue of Truro in Rhode Island. And George Washington writes and says, "My Jewish brothers, do not think that we are a Christian nation. We invite you as well to be a part. This is for you too." People ask me occasionally, are there Muslims in colonial America? There are in two ways. Some enslaved populations from Africa practice Islam and continue to practice on an individual level burial practices, prayer practices in some plantations. Also, there are occasional groups of Muslim merchants who end up in Charleston, South Carolina, in Boston, and in Philadelphia, who have temporary, they don't establish a mosque, but they have temporary prayer services and things like this. The other thing I want to say that historians are working on them is a sense of recovering these great ideas that we'll be reading about and thinking is important. I'm a little impatient with my colleagues of the 1619-ish project group. You know what I mean by that? A little impatient that they say, stop talking about the Declaration and the ideas of these white gentlemen. And I say, no, I'm not going to stop because that's really important. One of my favorite historians is a South Asian historian of South Asia. His name is Dipesh Chakrabarty. Dipesh Chakrabarty wrote a book that has shaped me a lot, in which he said, we, resisting the English inheritance and resisting colonization, should not overthrow those Western Enlightenment ideals, because they formed the very basis of our critique of colonialism. I think they're still useful. I think they're still important for us. Ralph Ellison, the great African-American novelist of the 1960s, says that we can't get rid of the 1776 ideals. They're the ones that should motivate us and keep us returning and keep us self-critical and keep us mindful. Is America exceptional? My closing statement. Is America exceptional? Too strong. It's not exceptional in it's not totally unique. Is it innovative? Yes. Does it have exceptional components? Yes. Were there moments of divine love breaking in? Yes. And I think we ought to fix on that and recover that. I urge you, read, talk, use this as a chance to think about who we are as a Christian community witnessing to politics in the nation today. So I'll stop there and
let's appreciate Mark for that carefully nuanced and very thoughtful presentation. You'll remember the three rules of this next 15 minutes. We want your questions. We want them to be brief. We want them to be civil. And we want them to be stated in the form of a question. So, are you raising your hand? I see, yes.
Thank you. Could you speak to the role of the Great Awakenings in the past? And also, there's been talk of America's due for another one.
Yes. So the Great Awakenings is a term that, just for those who don't know, that there was from about 1738 to 1742 a massive movement of religious revival and conversion led by Protestant preachers. We now call them evangelicals. They didn't call themselves evangelicals back then. They called themselves Christians. And that movement where it said, doesn't matter if you've been baptized, doesn't matter if you've been going to church, doesn't matter if you've been doing your family devotions, you still need to meet Jesus. And that is by God's power and grace, and so put yourselves at his mercy and meet Jesus. What was interesting is that message resonated. They say that nearly a third of all colonists in that period were touched by the Great Awakening. That produced a long-term political outcome. Remember I said the sort of anti-elite, the feeling like elites, which they associated with Church of England clergymen and carriages and wealth, came under critique from those people. An English preacher named George Whitefield, who came here, he was actually an Episcopal priest, but very much an evangelical and preaching revival. Whitefield was very big on critiquing English aristocracy at the same time. So the Awakening then produced somewhat of a political movement. It's a little late, I mean, it's 40 years later, 30, 40 years later, so there's not a direct line, but the sense that Christian faith stands against elitism and aristocracy. It stands for bringing in all people. It broke many racial barriers in many contexts, the Great Awakening. It started Baptist churches, especially in the South, who were racially very diverse in this period. Are we under a period in which we're awaiting a new religious awakening that produced a similar kind of political reform? I'm not a prophet. I don't know. I don't feel it. Do you feel it? No? You're not sure. I'm not sure either. I mean, it would be lovely if it did. I'm all for it. But I don't see it. I don't see many indications of it on the horizon.
Question here.
The newly named U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District of Virginia, a young woman lawyer who was a personal lawyer for Donald Trump, previously had the assignment of rooting out certain kinds of influences within the Smithsonian Institution. How does that play against the political movement that we identify with Trump? Where is this coming from within the administration?
Yeah, so what I know about that is there are directives to the Smithsonian Institution to remove statements and displays and the little things you read when you go through a museum, of removing those things that imply that the real story America had to do with slavery and dispossession of indigenous lands, that produced a self-critical view of America, and that downplayed its sense of America's importance. That feeds into the contemporary political right, which uses that kind of historical reimagining, uses that to get rid of DEI initiatives, highly critical attitudes towards the Republican Party in certain areas. Does that answer your question? Give me more. Give me more then. I suspected it didn't, but give me one more run at it.
You're going to keep going, or you want to hear?
No, I want to hear a little more.
No, I'm trying to sort of put my finger on the source of this. How does it relate to Trump's political strategy? Where is it coming from within the administration?
Okay, I speak now as
Usual suspects being Stephen Miller and...
Yeah. I speak now as an amateur, right? I'm not a contemporary political scientist or observer, and you know Washington, D.C. much better than I do. I live in Little St. Louis. But my sense is that there are people in the Trump administration who, like Stephen Miller and others, who really think that this is a genuine problem, denigrating America's past, pointing out the negative parts of it. We need to be strong as a nation. It's tinged with very nationalist assumptions about the power of the nation being the goal of the nation. If you were here yesterday, I said that's where Reinhold Niebuhr put his finger on a sore spot and said, nations, once they become powerful, they tend to run to increase their power or maintain their power, and becomes their sole purpose. I think there are people in the administration who are advising. I think my sense is that those who are interested in the election of Republican Trump-affiliated political types think that this move is useful because it will gain popular assent.
Question over here.
Yeah, people say patriotism is a polite form of tribalism. Mm-hmm. And recognizing the special nature of 1776 and the founding, what is the most compelling Reformed Christian critique of this tribalism?
Tribalism, yeah, it's taken in a negative sense. I mean, there's some sense in which belonging to a tribe, the word is a little funky these days, but it is important to get yourself out of your own private sphere into a sphere of some more extended relationships, and loyalties is a good thing. I think what Christianity says about hyper-patriotism or religious nationalism as a focus, what it says is that is so short-sighted. We belong to something much more. We belong to a worldwide, universal communion of people in which we embrace the humanity and worth of all people, and we embrace especially the nature of our faith community as not being an American faith community, but as being a Jesus-centered faith community that exists in every part of the world. So I think the more we get theological and the more we think about it, the less we become nationalistic in that way that you're talking about.
He says on World Communion Sunday.
Oh, yeah, see, it's perfect. So, and I should point out, today is World Communion Sunday.
Here's a question.
I'm very interested to learn more the American exceptionalism and patriotism in Christianity. Do you think President Trump and his cabinet is trying very hard to introduce this to the world for the acceptance and to the understanding of the history of American patriotism in Christianity? Thank you.
The question was, do I think that the current administration is attempting to talk about what's good about America, its exceptional qualities? Is Trump trying to actually introduce that to the world? I think Trump himself would say he's ended 7 wars, right? I think he has said that. Is it 6 or 7? 7. So I think he would want to make the claim that he's doing that. I don't think he's doing it. I don't think that's really in, but I'm way beyond my expertise. I speak now to you. This is out of the 18th century. I'm speaking to you now as a fellow Christian and a fellow citizen who thinks about these issues. I do. I read a lot, and I work in a Center for the Study of Religion and Politics, so I know some things. But my general impression is I do not think that Trump thinks very well or fully in internationalist terms.
Let me ask a final question and try to bring together a lot of what you said in terms of how we actually celebrate this, or commemorate, observe this occasion. And it balances at the same, well, perhaps at the same time, but it balances celebration and the lifting up of ideals and also the critique. Do you have in your imagination an event where that comes together, or a picture of what that looks like? Or is it just sort of a thesis, antithesis, synthesis move that we make as we move towards 2026?
Thank you for saying that impossible to answer question. But I'll give a shot at it. I think a biblical Christian stance towards such things as the history of this nation should be shaped by a realistic discussion. We need to read, talk together. Two books that I would recommend: The Radicalism of the American Revolution by Gordon Wood, and a recent book by Kathleen Duval, D-U-V-A-L, on the internationalism of the American Revolution. And she talks about indigenous histories as well. Those books, studying together, reading them together, talking about them together, I think would be important. But I think the one thing I want out of these discussions is a discussion of what Christian hope is. What is hope in our situation? I think we do not, what we should do is not be overcome by cynicism, by depression, by resignation. But I think hope is what we would look for. So an event that talks and works with each other to pinpoint those areas of hopefulness.
Well, with that, thank you, Mark.